Right, so what we're going to talk about now is how electricity goes through the heart, so the intrinsic conduction system of the heart and the pacemaker cells. So basically, here's the idea. To contract rhythmically, heart doesn't have to have an input from the nervous system. So what I'm trying to tell you is that the heart can contract by itself. And it can do so because there are pacemaker cells in the heart. So pacemaker cells are producing so-called pacemaker potential. And we're going to learn how it is formed, what forms it. So if we have millivolts on the y-axis and time on the x-axis, right? So the first step of forming the pacemaker potential is through the influx of sodium through constantly opened leaky channels. That makes sense. So cell depolarizes slowly, right? Cell depolarizes. And when it reaches a certain threshold, calcium channels open. So this is your, and you remember, when we were talking about the ions, concentration of calcium outside is higher, right? So influx of calcium, this time through the voltage-gated channels. Okay, that makes sense. So when they reach the peak, it closes, and now potassium channels open, and potassium diffuses out of the cell through voltage-gated channels, which close here at the bottom. Right? They close, sodium channels are still open, so have another potential. Okay, again, sodium. And you can see here that there's no external stimulus, basically, right? So there's no neurotransmitter, nothing. So it just goes, sodium channels open, then it results at a certain point in the opening of calcium channels, influx of calcium results in the depolarization of pacemaker cell. Does that make sense? That's your impulse. That is an impulse. That peak is an impulse, an electrical impulse.
Is the calcium coming from the sarcoplasmic?
No, in this case from just extracellular fluid. Yeah, that's extracellular. That's a good question, actually, extracellular fluid. This is why, actually, and thank you for the question, because when we're going to be talking about the regulation of cardiac output, calcium is one of the critical ions that regulates cardiac output. And essentially, calcium levels in the blood will affect cardiac output. Does that make sense? So basically, if you think about it, let me explain. So the more calcium we have in extracellular fluid / blood, the faster it will diffuse into the cell. Does that make sense? The faster it diffuses into the cell, the steeper that curve is going to be. Am I clear? The steeper that curve, the more frequent your heartbeat is. Because it will just happen more frequently, right? So, and it is true, if you will do the IV injection of calcium, it will increase heart rate. Okay? Now, does that make sense?
Yes.
This part. Okay, awesome. So that's your pacemaker potential. Next, we're going to talk about the conduction system. Okay, so here's the heart, right? So you've got right atrium, left ventricle, right ventricle. Okay, we good? So think of the conduction system of the heart as the system of wires that transmit the signal, the electrical signal, throughout the wall, throughout the myocardium. Does that make sense? So it all starts here in the sinoatrial node. It's in the wall of the right atrium, literally in the wall of the right atrium. And now imagine sinoatrial node, check this out, it depolarizes. Okay? Depolarizes, right? So you probably remember in our previous conversation that cells, muscle cells, and by the way, these pacemaker cells, these pacemaker cells are transformed myocytes. So they are basically myocytes that don't contract, but instead set up the rhythm. Does that make sense? So these pacemaker cells are connected to other cardiomyocytes, other muscle cells in the heart by gap junctions. Are we clear? And cardiomyocytes themselves are connected to each other by gap junctions as well. We good so far? Does that make sense? Oh, and I forgot to mention, so particularly this part here, this is called pacemaker potential. Sorry about that. Okay? So sodium ions form pacemaker potential. I know that there's a question on the study guide. Yes, sodium ions form pacemaker potential. Okay? Now, look. When SA node, when pacemaker cells in the SA node, when they depolarize, this depolarization depolarizes adjacent cardiomyocytes. Does that make sense? Because of the gap junctions.
Yes.
And this depolarization wave essentially spreads out through the wall of the right and left atrium. Does that make sense? So when sinoatrial node depolarizes, that starts the depolarization of atria. This depolarization reaches atrioventricular node, which is located at the border between the right atrium and the right ventricle. We good so far? It's like in the myocardium. It's in the myocardium. So when I say this SA node, it's not just like hanging around somewhere in the atrium. It's in the wall. It's the part of the myocardium. Same as AV node. And then a pretty cool thing happens. So AV node, it has very few connections to the next set of pacemaker cells. So the signal, I'm going to explain some stuff here. The signal from AV node goes into so-called atrioventricular bundle, which is going through the septum that separates right and left ventricle. Does that make sense? So it is physically in the septum. This bundle branches, and not surprisingly, these structures are called bundle branches. And then bundle branches, they form so-called Purkinje fibers. Okay, are you following me on this one? So you have a whole bunch of fibers that go through the walls of the ventricles. So now look what happens when depolarization waves goes through the heart. So when SA node is depolarized, you've got a depolarization, start depolarization of atria. This depolarization wave reaches AV node here, and then goes into the septum. At this point, nothing happens to ventricles yet. The electrical impulse has to reach Purkinje fibers. When it reaches Purkinje fibers, that's the most of the wall, most of the myocardium starts to get depolarized. Does that make sense?
So the ventricles are depolarized when the signal reaches the Purkinje fibers.
They mostly, yes. So basically, remember, this process is very fast. So this electrical impulse going through the cells, it goes pretty fast. By the time it reaches Purkinje fibers, that's the moment when the walls of myocardium start to contract, basically. So, one important thing that we need to remember. So remember I mentioned which structures allow for a massive depolarization of atria. Gap junctions, right?
Can you repeat your question?
So, yeah, so when SA node is depolarizing, the depolarization wave spreads through the atria because of the gap junctions.
Okay.
Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
So immediate question, why doesn't it spread from atria to ventricles just through the myocardium? The answer is simple. There are no gap junctions that connect atria and ventricles. Does that make sense? The only electrical connection between atria and ventricles is going through AV node. Does it make sense?
Yes.
This is very important for kind of two main reasons. First, look, since this depolarization wave reaches ventricles through the bundle and bundle branches, since it reaches through only one path, ventricular contraction is highly controlled, highly synchronized. Does that make sense? And second, it means that ventricular contraction is delayed compared to the atrial contraction. Make sense? Moreover, think of it, so imagine that depolarization wave is a bunch of people that running around in atria, okay? And next they have to go into the AV bundle. And the only door they can go through is AV node, okay? So you have a whole bunch of people trying to squeeze through the AV node, which means it's going to be slow. The impulse actually, the electrical impulse, is actually delayed at AV node. And that allows your atria to contract first. There's a pause, and then eventually ventricles will contract. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And this is critical because you want it to be in a certain sequence. Am I clear? Now, let's talk about structures that set the heart rate. Remember, pacemakers, right? So the principle is this: the faster the node, the faster the structure, the higher the role of it in the hierarchy of setting the heart rate. So sinoatrial node, its intrinsic heart rate is approximately 100 beats per minute. It can be different. 100, 120 is fine. Okay, we'll get to this. AV node is 50, 60. You don't need to memorize the numbers. It's not important. So when SA node, we'll get, okay. We good so far? And then bundle, branches, and so on. Purkinje fibers. They rhythm, intrinsic rhythm is 40 beats per minute. Is that clear?
So this is if
So
SA node were to be the one thing that controls.
it would be 100 BPM.
Okay.
If SA node dies, myocardial infarction, it doesn't work anymore. AV node takes over. So this is called junctional rhythm. Okay.
If AV node takes
If AV node's gone, if SA node is gone, AV node takes over. So we've got junctional rhythm. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Can you survive on 50, 60 BPM? I'm talking about an average person. I'm not talking about hypothetical Michael Phelps who has like 45 BPM, resting heart rate. 50, 60, you can. You're not going to be too comfortable, right? But you can. Okay, does that make sense? What if, for some reason, SA and AV nodes both are out, or even, look at this, even worse, or better, I don't know. Your AV node is dysfunctional and doesn't let the signal to go through. Bundle and bundle branches and Purkinje fibers will take over. Does that make sense? Now they will set at 40 BPM. Can an average person survive at 40 BPM? Not for long, at least. Not for long. So this is what, like, if AV node is, it's called a heart block, we can talk about it. If AV node is gone, then you gotta do a pacemaker thing. Okay. Make sense so far? Now, what is a normal resting heart rate for an average healthy adult?
60 to 80.
70. We'll get 70 because it's an average of 60 to 80, right? It's just easier. So I would honestly say, like, if you look, 70 is more common for an untrained person. 70 is fine. 60, you already has some kind of fitness background, okay? For an amateur with a very good fitness background, 50s. For a professional athlete, can be as low as 40. It's insane. So, why it is 70, but sinoatrial node is 100? Well, it's kind of an interesting thing. So, heart is controlled by both parasympathetic and sympathetic branches of autonomic nervous system. Does that make sense? So at rest, parasympathetic system slows down the heart. Does that make sense? So think of it this way. Your heart intrinsically beats at 100 BPM. But parasympathetic nervous system constantly pushes on the brakes, keeping your heart rate at 70. Does that make sense? When you get excited, parasympathetic stimulation first goes away, right? So we can draw something like this, like excitation. It removes the parasympathetic inhibition. Your heart rate starts to rise, and at some point, sympathetic stimulation kicks in. Does that make sense?
Why does, I mean, I know 100 beats per minute isn't great, because because you're overworking the heart, but like what is that the point of the parasympathetic pressing on the brakes?
Well, one of my favorite statements, there's no why question in biology. For some reason, this works for humans, evolutionary. So I don't know really in like evolutionary terms why we don't have SA node setting it up at 70 and then your sympathetic system just kicks in when needed, right? I don't really know.
Okay.
Maybe it's, it was more evolutionary beneficial to have it like this. So basically, if all your body needs to do is to get it to 100, you don't really need to get sympathetic system engaged. You just, stop parasympathetic. You get excited a little bit, and this a little bit reduces parasympathetic inhibition of the heart, so to say. Okay, does that make sense? Good? Yeah. And then if needed, sympathetic system can kick in. So we usually say that at rest, heart is on the parasympathetic tone. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, all the regulatory centers are in medulla oblongata. And these centers are called cardioinhibitory for parasympathetic branch, right? And cardioacceleratory for sympathetic. You can think of it this way. Like, structurally, without any analogies really, you can think of it this way. You have two groups of neurons. You have parasympathetic neurons and sympathetic neurons. Right now, in you and me, parasympathetic neurons do the work. They constantly push on the brakes, okay? This is your cardioinhibitory center. If I were to, go for a run, that's immediately sympathetic stimulation because of the exercise. But even before the sympathetic stimulation, my parasympathetic system will get, will go down in activity. So that group of neurons will not release acetylcholine to slow my heart down. My heart rate will slightly go up, then sympathetic stimulation of cardioacceleratory neurons will kick in, and it will go even higher than that. Does that make sense? So the rhythm, the normal rhythm, is called a sinus rhythm. So sinus rhythm, we can basically put it this way. You have its SA node plus cardioinhibitory, right? Does that make sense? So here's the deal. If your SA node doesn't work, then cardioinhibitory neurons, they really don't have, anything to signal to. Makes sense, right? Now, what I wanted to say. Yeah, this is a really good example, clinical example. That disclaimer, not mine. It was told to me by a colleague of mine. Real case. So patient recently, like 1 day ago, received a heart transplant. The patient is stable, he's in ICU, he's stable, totally fine. And the nurse comes in to check on him and notices that he has like 110 heart rate. And she's panicking, really scared. She runs out of the unit, approaches a physician and says, this patient has tachycardia. And the physician says, no, he doesn't. She says, but his heart rate is 110. Physician goes, I know. So he has tachycardia. He goes, he doesn't. And she doesn't understand. What's the explanation? Why 110 for that patient who just received the transplant? Why it's normal now? It's a very mechanistic question, very like almost at the visceral physical level.
Because you can't, like the parasympathetic nerves that were attached to the old heart can't be reattached to the
Yep.
new heart.
Yep, basically the branch of the vagus nerve that innervated the heart, and I need to put it here. It's a vagus, obviously. That's all parasympathetic regulation of all abdominal organs and thoracic organs, vagus. So it's a vagus nerve by a vagus nerve. Okay. So they cut the branch of the vagus nerve, put the new heart in, right, and all like it's gone. So 110 is now kind of new normal for the guy. That makes sense? So, good illustration of that concept. Okay, I think I'm trying to think about, what we, yeah. So, basically, sinus rhythm, SA node, junctional rhythm, AV node, and I don't think that bundle branches and Purkinje fibers have any name for that rhythm.